Despite crushed knees and torn ligaments, Liza Minnelli was still forced by the casino to use cocaine and Valium to perform 2 full shows a night. She was virtually confined in the exact Las Vegas rooms where her own mother had cried in panic and vomited years ago. The capitalists gave no rest, nonchalantly intoxicating her with hard liquor and painkillers to drain her vocal cords. Just minutes later, this drug-dependent patient rushed onto the stage, dancing and singing until her throat tore to satisfy tens of thousands of gamblers. The crowd cheered, satisfying their search for the shadow of Judy Garland on a body tearing apart day by day. Out of what fear did Liza quietly accept, letting the casino drag her down the exact path of self-destruction her mother had walked? In the 1970s and 1980s, the Las Vegas Strip was undergoing a massive seismic transition. The old handshake and intimidation tactics of the mob-run era, overseen by men who at least possessed a rudimentary, old-school respect for the performers, were being rapidly replaced by the cold, unyielding mathematical formulas of corporate hospitality boards and Wall Street investors. However, the core philosophy of the desert remained exactly the same: extract maximum wealth from the tourist with minimum liability to the house. In this sanitized corporate environment, live entertainment was entirely divorced from any concept of artistic expression, emotional catharsis, or theatrical preservation. The towering entertainment palaces, the massive showrooms seating thousands of people, outfitted with state-of-the-art acoustics, heavy velvet curtains, and complex lighting rigs, did not host lavish stage spectacles to celebrate music or dance. They operated these multi-million-dollar, highly complex showrooms strictly as loss leaders. The corporate executives running these empires willingly and happily accepted staggering financial deficits on the production of the show itself. They did not care if the massive union orchestra costs, the exorbitant electricity bills for the lighting, or the elaborate stage design vastly exceeded the revenue generated by the physical ticket sales. The true massive profit lay entirely outside the heavy wooden theater doors, waiting under the bright, artificial fluorescent lights of the casino floor. Liza Minnelli was never brought to the Nevada desert to merely sell concert tickets or entertain a polite seated crowd for 90 minutes. The executives did not view her as an autonomous artist. She was fundamentally priced, contracted, and utilized as a massive biological stimulant. Her explicit, though unwritten, directive from the hotel bosses was to violently drain her own physical life force directly onto the stage. She was tasked with generating a literal nuclear explosion of adrenaline, sound, and kinetic movement. This energy was specifically designed to directly infect and overwhelm the nervous systems of the thousands of spectators sitting in the dark. The ultimate overarching goal of the casino executives was measured by a cold, calculated daily metric known in the hospitality industry as the drop, the total gross amount of cash exchanged for casino chips at the tables and fed into the slot machines. After the final curtain fell, particularly following the rowdy, alcohol-fueled midnight show, the executives needed that massive crowd to spill out of the theater, vibrating with a frantic, uncontrollable euphoria. They needed the audience's baseline adrenaline and dopamine levels, artificially spiked by the sheer physical exertion they had just witnessed from Minnelli. The psychological warfare was brilliantly sinister. A calm, relaxed, or emotionally fulfilled audience goes up to their hotel rooms, orders room service, and goes to sleep. A hyper-stimulated, manic, euphoric audience marches directly to the blackjack tables, the roulette wheels, and the baccarat pits, recklessly spending their life savings to chase the emotional high they just witnessed on stage. The physical architecture of every major hotel on the Strip was actively, strategically weaponized to capture and exploit this chemically altered state. The showrooms were never placed near the front exits or the hotel lobbies. They were intentionally buried deep within the absolute rear of the property. This layout forced the hyper-stimulated, often heavily intoxicated audience to navigate a relentless, confusing maze of gambling pits and thousands of ringing, flashing slot machines just to get out. The carpets were designed with loud, aggressive, swirling geometric patterns to keep the eyes moving and induce a mild sense of disorientation. Clocks and windows were entirely banned from the casino floor to completely eradicate the human concept of time. The casinos actively pumped heavily oxygenated cool air into the room to keep the patrons awake and alert long past their natural bedtimes. The audience physically had to walk past the gambling pits, assaulted by the sensory overload of the casino, before they could even find the exit doors. Liza Minnelli's sole corporate job was to prime their nervous systems for this exact predatory journey. To ensure this biological revenue machine never stopped operating, the legal contracts binding the artists to the casinos were absolute ironclad shackles. The corporate boards viewed an empty showroom not just as a lost night of entertainment, but as a catastrophic failure of the entire casino floor ecosystem. If sheer physical exhaustion, a torn knee ligament from dancing on concrete, or a severe bleeding throat infection forced an artist to cancel a single performance, the casino did not simply offer a rain check to the ticket holders or sympathy to the star. They deployed devastating multi-million-dollar lawsuits based on a brutal, unforgiving legal concept known as liquidated damages. The casino lawyers, backed by limitless corporate funds, would not just sue the artist for the direct cost of the canceled show, the idle orchestra fees, or the refunded tickets. They would sue for the millions in projected theoretical gambling revenue that they claimed was lost on the casino floor that specific night because the artist failed to draw the crowd and spike the adrenaline. They mathematically argued that by not performing, Liza had directly robbed the baccarat and craps tables of their anticipated nightly yield. This ruthless, terrifying legal strategy effectively stripped the artist of any basic, fundamental human right to be sick, to be injured, or to be exhausted. The omnipresent threat of total financial ruin, federal lawsuits, and permanent industry blacklisting kept them on the stage, regardless of their cellular reality or physical agony. Under this system, you were no longer an autonomous human being. You were the vital beating heart of a corporate revenue generator, and you were strictly forbidden from stopping. During her peak residencies at iconic properties like the Riviera and the Sahara, Minnelli commanded unprecedented, record-breaking weekly salaries that dwarfed her contemporaries. The hospitality boards weaponized these exact staggering financial figures against her. By paying her top-tier, multi-million-dollar contracts, the casino bosses completely absolved themselves of any moral or legal obligation to her physical safety. They viewed the exorbitant paychecks not as compensation for her vocal talent, but as a direct, upfront purchase of her skeletal structure and nervous system. She was the highest paid female performer on the Strip, but that wealth was a gilded cage. The money legally justified the eradication of standard labor laws, mandated rest days, and basic human dignity. The trap, however, was not constructed of rigid legal contracts and predatory casino floor plans alone. to keep the patrons walking from the showroom directly to the baccarat tables, the executives needed to emotionally devastate them first. They needed a spectacle so visceral that it transcended mere entertainment and tapped into collective cultural memory. This required the casino bosses to look beyond Liza Minnelli's immense standalone talent and peer directly into her darkest, most deeply buried childhood traumas, weaponizing the very ghost that haunted her. A massive, highly profitable segment of the Las Vegas audience during the 1970s and 1980s was not simply buying a ticket to see an independent, evolving, standalone artist named Liza Minnelli. When they handed over their cash at the box office, they were buying a highly priced admission ticket to attend an industrial seance. They wanted to witness the ghost of Judy Garland resurrected on the neon-lit Vegas Strip, and the casino management ruthlessly, systematically capitalized on this generational trauma. The corporate executives, men who analyzed human psychology solely through the lens of profit margins, understood that grief, nostalgia, and tragedy, when properly packaged and aggressively marketed, formed a phenomenally lucrative commodity. The American public harbored a morbid, insatiable obsession with the tragic, premature demise of her mother in 1969. The casino bosses knew with absolute forensic certainty what the crowd truly wanted to see when the heavy velvet curtain rose, and they were prepared to orchestrate every single detail of the production to deliver it. They consistently and aggressively pressured Liza to perform her mother's iconic, emotionally devastating repertoire. The production teams, guided entirely by the financial directives of the house, deliberately manipulated the theatrical spotlight angles. They would drop the massive stage into stark, high-contrast shadows to evoke inescapable, visceral visual memories of Garland's legendary, tragic Carnegie Hall performances. The orchestral arrangements were purposefully tweaked by musical directors to mirror the exact swells, crashes, and emotional desperation of Judy's historical arrangements. More insidiously, they subtly coerced Liza into mimicking those desperate, trembling, hyper-emotional vocal vibratos that had defined her mother's final agonizing years on stage. They did not want Liza's strength. They wanted the illusion of Judy's fragility. This emotional exploitation extended seamlessly into her own cinematic triumphs. The casino bosses heavily capitalized on her Oscar-winning portrayal of Sally Bowles, demanding she recreate the desperate Weimar-era decadence of cabaret every single night. They actively blurred the lines between the fictional, self-destructive nightclub singer and the real woman on stage, marketing her genuine psychological struggles as an extension of the character. When she belted out the theme from New York, New York, a song demanding absolute conquering vocal triumph, the executives required her to deliver it with a manic, almost terrifying intensity. The audience demanded to see the veins bulging in her neck and the sweat flying from her face, turning songs of survival into agonizing, breathless endurance tests. Night after night, the American entertainment industry literally forced a grieving daughter to tear open her deepest, most profound psychological wounds in front of thousands of intoxicated strangers. They actively commercialized her genetic grief. They forced her to bleed out her own mother's ghost for maximum casino revenue, exploiting her deepest, most intimate vulnerability as a strategic, highly effective marketing tool. It was a psychological torture masquerading as a musical tribute. Furthermore, she endured this biomechanical nightmare in absolute gendered isolation. The legendary male headliners who had previously dominated the Las Vegas ecosystem navigated the predatory casino environment with a protective collective brotherhood. They shared the stage, split the vocal demands, and dictated their own casual conversational pacing, often performing with a drink in hand and barely breaking a sweat. Minnelli was afforded no such luxury. As a solitary female headliner carrying the entire financial weight of the showroom, the casino executives demanded continuous punishing athletic exertion. She was not allowed to simply stand at a microphone and sing. She was contractually obligated to deliver an explosive, high-impact cardiovascular spectacle that her male counterparts were never subjected to. The physical and biological demands required to sustain this massive nightly psychological illusion were entirely inhuman and medically unsustainable. The Las Vegas industry standard of the era dictated a brutal, unforgiving, and relentless schedule. 2 grueling, high-energy performances every single night without fail. There was the high-profile dinner show at 8 o'clock in the evening, immediately followed by the rowdy, alcohol-fueled midnight show. This staggering schedule stretched across 6, or sometimes 7, consecutive days a week. That amounted to an astonishing 14 high-intensity, biomechanically punishing spectacles in a matter of days. The microscopic windows of rest between the final, breathless bow of the early show and the blaring orchestral overture of the late show offered her cellular structure absolutely no chance to recover. Her muscles had no time to cool down. Her body could not repair the thousands of microscopic tissue tears she had just sustained in her calves and thighs, and her circulatory system could not flush the burning toxic buildup of lactic acid from her bloodstream. She was permanently operating in a state of severe, compounding physical deficit. She was drowning in her own cellular exhaustion. The iconic, highly stylized choreography she executed, heavily influenced by her legendary collaborator, the Broadway director and choreographer, Bob Fosse, was a breathtaking visual triumph, but it was a catastrophic biomechanical nightmare. This highly idiosyncratic dance style was never designed for physical longevity, joint preservation, or anatomical safety. Instead, it was built strictly for immediate visual impact, aggressive sexual tension, and sharp, isolating movements. The choreography demanded unnatural skeletal contortions from the performers. These required positions directly opposed the natural and healthy alignment of the human body. Dancers regularly had to execute severe, turned-in knee positions during these routines. This forced the femur and tibia into an unnatural internal rotation while bearing a heavy physical load. Additionally, the style required continuous violent pelvic thrusts. This repetitive motion consistently compressed the lower lumbar spine and jarred the sacroiliac joint. The upper body suffered equally as the routine called for hunched, rigid shoulders. This prolonged posture restricted deep, natural diaphragmatic breathing and locked the cervical spine into place. Finally, dancers performed explosive high kicks, snapping their legs to hyperextend the hamstrings. They then brought their full body weight crashing back down onto a single, locked joint. She executed these violent kinetic impacts repeatedly on hard, unsprung wooden or concrete theater floors. Performing these brutal, high-impact routines while wearing rigid, elevated theatrical high heels sent devastating, unmitigated kinetic shock waves straight up her skeletal system with every single step, leap, and landing. The inevitable, mathematically certain medical result of this daily physical trauma was the systematic pulverization of the meniscal cartilage in her knees. The natural fluid-filled shock absorbers in her joints were entirely ground away by the sheer repetitive force of the choreography. Her spinal discs became severely compressed under the repeated impact, leading to herniations, and she suffered countless agonizing micro-tears across her major ligaments. She was quite literally grinding her skeleton into dust for the applause. Furthermore, the architectural design of the specific Las Vegas stages she commanded actively exacerbated this anatomical ruin. To ensure optimal sight lines for the massive, sprawling booths at the back of the room, many of these elite showrooms utilized raked stages, built with a severe permanent downward slope toward the audience. Executing aggressive high-impact Fosse choreography on a sharply angled incline fundamentally altered her center of gravity. It forced her to constantly fight a downward physical momentum, placing unprecedented tearing strain on her Achilles tendons and pushing the entirety of her kinetic impact directly onto her knees with every single landing. She was not just dancing, she was constantly physically braking against gravity in high heels. While her skeletal system was being actively dismantled from the ground up, her vocal cords were suffering an equally barbaric, unrelenting assault in the hostile desert environment. Piercing through the thick, drunken, chaotic clamor of a 2,000-seat Vegas showroom was a monumental physiological task. Competing against the continuous clinking of heavy glassware, the murmuring roar of the crowd, and the blaring, unamplified brass of a massive 30-piece live orchestra required her to push her voice far beyond any safe anatomical limits. To survive the acoustic warfare of the room, she could not rely on delicate, protected vocal technique. Instead, she relied heavily on intense, damaging chest belting and aggressive, raspy vocal growls to project pure, brute acoustic power over the noise. She was executing this vocal assault while pushing her resting heart rate well above 150 beats per minute, performing high-intensity cardiovascular routines while desperately inhaling the bone-dry, heavily air-conditioned desert air. To make matters worse, this air was perpetually thick with secondary, unfiltered cigarette and cigar smoke, creating a highly toxic, corrosive environment for the delicate mucosal lining of a singer's throat. This lethal combination of extreme vocal friction, severe cellular dehydration, and constant chemical irritation caused continuous, bleeding microhemorrhages across her vocal folds. This continuous trauma led directly to the formation of rigid, painful, fibrous nodules on her vocal cords, permanently altering and threatening the very instrument she relied upon for her survival. Furthermore, the physical weight of her glamorous, carefully constructed stage persona was a literal crushing burden on her fragile, exhausted frame. The iconic, shimmering, crystal-encrusted garments designed by fashion legends like Halston were visual masterpieces, but they were practically armor. They routinely weighed between 5 and 10 kilograms. She was trapped wearing these heavy garments under blazing industrial incandescent spotlights that routinely pushed the on-stage ambient temperatures past a sweltering 40 degrees Celsius. She sweated out massive, dangerous volumes of water and essential electrolytes during every single dance number, frequently suffering agonizing, locking muscle cramps right there on the stage. Yet, because the casino demanded the illusion of effortless joy, she was contractually and professionally obligated to force a radiant, joyful smile through the blinding physical agony. Backstage, the reality of the performance was even more frantic, panicked, and physically punishing. She had less than 60 seconds in the pitch-black, cramped wings of the theater to rip off the soaked, heavy, suffocating garments. Handlers would aggressively strip her down, throw on another heavy, tightly fitted beaded costume, secure her microphone pack, and literally physically push her back out into the blinding, searing lights before the orchestra finished the 30-second musical vamp. As the cartilage turned to dust and the vocal cords hemorrhaged under the relentless strain of the Fosse choreography and the bone-dry desert heat, her human biology inevitably began to fail. But the Las Vegas machine, fiercely protecting the millions of dollars tied to the nightly drop, could not accept a biological failure. When sheer force of will and adrenaline were no longer enough to carry her onto the stage, the corporation stepped in, replacing necessary physical recovery with a chilling, highly regulated regime of pharmacological warfare. When Liza Minnelli's body inevitably began to shut down under this catastrophic daily pressure, when her knees finally locked, her voice bled into a harsh metallic whisper, and her muscles seized entirely in the dark wings of the theater. The Las Vegas hospitality machine did not offer hospital visits, necessary physical therapy, or a legally mandated moment of rest. A canceled show meant a dark casino floor, and a dark casino floor was an unforgivable, fireable offense for the corporate executives in charge. Instead, the corporation deployed their own retained casino doctors directly into the underground concrete bunkers to physically fix the problem and ensure the heavy velvet curtain went up on time. These medical professionals did not operate under the standard Hippocratic oath. Their primary allegiance was to the corporate ledger and the casino's daily drop. They functioned exactly like pit stop mechanics in a high-stakes, ruthless racing circuit. They were tasked solely with keeping the biological engine running through the end of the fiscal quarter, utilizing whatever extreme short-term chemical means were necessary. They completely, callously disregarded the long-term, irreversible devastation they were inflicting on the artist's anatomy. This ruthless corporate medical intervention birthed a terrifying, highly regulated three-stage chemical loop that quickly dictated, consumed, and entirely replaced her natural biological rhythms. She was no longer running on human energy. She was running on a meticulously calculated pharmaceutical cocktail. This stage was engineered directly in the dressing room, mere minutes before the massive orchestra was scheduled to begin the blaring overture. Casino doctors routinely drove long, thick hypodermic needles full of potent, liquid cortisone directly into her inflamed, swollen knee joints. This powerful, localized steroid artificially and immediately masked the agonizing, burning inflammation in her synovial fluid. It allowed her to physically bend her legs and execute the punishing Bob Fosse choreography. However, basic medical science dictates that repeated intra-articular cortisone injections actively inhibit collagen synthesis. By repeatedly masking the pain and forcing her to dance on a numb, compromised joint, the doctors were guaranteeing severe cartilage necrosis. They were essentially deliberately rotting the joint from the inside out over time, cold-bloodedly trading her future long-term mobility for a successful 90-minute performance that evening. But simply silencing the localized mechanical pain in her joints was not enough to override her profound systemic cellular exhaustion. Ahead of the curtain call, the crippling pressure of the environment drove her directly into the devastating grip of illicit cocaine and pharmaceutical-grade amphetamines. This was a catastrophic habit born in the manic, glittering VIP rooms of Studio 54, but it was silently and aggressively encouraged by a casino ecosystem that demanded relentless energy. The handlers deliberately turned a blind eye, allowing these heavy stimulants to violently hack her biology. They paralyzed her natural pain receptors and forced a battered, completely depleted central nervous system to flood her brain with artificial dopamine and synthetic adrenaline. She was blasted out onto the stage not on natural human energy, but on a terrifying wave of chemical rocket fuel. Her pupils dilated, her resting heart rate spiked to dangerous arrhythmic levels, and her brain was completely disconnected from the actual compounding physical damage her muscular and skeletal systems were actively sustaining under the sweltering stage lights. The second stage of this terrifying daily chemical cycle was designed to manage the peripheral, unavoidable bodily agony that the illicit stimulants and localized cortisone shots could not fully suppress. As the sheer physical trauma of the high-impact choreography set in mid-performance, the central nervous system screamed for relief. To survive the 90 minutes, hard liquor, primarily neat, uniced vodka, became a necessary, daily, and highly functional tool. This alcohol was not consumed for pleasure, celebration, or social relaxation. It was utilized strictly as an industrial anesthetic. She drank to broadly numb her fraying peripheral nerve endings. The alcohol acted as a central nervous system depressant, allowing her to momentarily ignore the stabbing, grinding pain of her actively disintegrating knee joints and her compressed spinal discs as she bounded across the stage in high heels. She was caught in a highly dangerous, medically contradictory physiological crossfire. Her brain and cardiovascular system were being chemically hyperstimulated and pushed to the absolute brink of a massive coronary event by the cocaine, while her peripheral nervous system was being simultaneously depressed, poisoned, and numbed by the heavy influx of vodka. Her liver and kidneys were working at maximum unsustainable capacity to filter the toxic load while she was simultaneously singing at the absolute top of her lungs. The final stage of this brutal daily chemical loop was the forced coma. By the time the midnight show finally concluded, the heavy curtain fell, the final VIPs had been ushered out of the dressing room, and the residual adrenaline of the standing ovation began to wane. It was often past 2 or 3 in the morning. However, her brain was still misfiring wildly from the massive compounding influx of synthetic stimulants. She was physically shattered, her muscles trembling violently with fatigue. Yet neurologically, she was sprinting at top speed, her eyes wide open and her heart racing in the silent desert night. To forcefully shut this violent, vibrating biological machinery down so she could theoretically rest before the next day's grueling shows, her handlers fed her heavy, highly dangerous doses of Valium and potent pharmaceutical barbiturates. This severe chemical intervention did not provide natural, restorative REM cycle sleep. Deep sleep is the only time the human body can engage in cellular repair, muscle regeneration, and cognitive processing. The barbiturates robbed her of this entirely. Instead, the pills violently induced a chemical blackout. They plunged her into a synthetic, severely depressed coma for just a few precious hours, drastically lowering her respiratory rate to borderline dangerous levels. She would wake up the next afternoon groggy, chemically hungover, physically battered, and severely dehydrated. Yet there was no time to recover. The entire nightmare loop of cortisone, cocaine, vodka, and barbiturates had to be forcefully, mechanically restarted ahead of the 8 o'clock overture. She was entirely, hopelessly trapped within this toxic cycle by a literal, impenetrable wall of complicit enablers. This was the iron ring of isolation. Her management team, her highly paid legal representatives, her personal assistants, and the casino executives formed an airtight, aggressively defensive ring around her. They protected their own massive financial interests, their exorbitant corporate salaries, and their exclusive access to the Las Vegas power structures far above her actual biological life. Any mid-level staff member, backing musician, wardrobe assistant, or backstage technician who dared to express genuine human concern, suggest entering a medical rehabilitation facility, or recommend a temporary break to heal her failing joints was instantly terminated. They were fired on the spot, legally gagged, blacklisted from the production, and physically escorted off the casino property by armed security. The lavish, excessive livelihoods of this massive entourage depended entirely on her absolute compliance. Their exclusive access to the Vegas wealth, the complimentary luxury penthouse suites, the free fine dining, and their proximity to global celebrity depended entirely, completely, on keeping Liza Minnelli standing on that stage and the casino floor packed. They effectively operated as parasites, feeding directly off the continuous, highly profitable destruction of their host. By systematically firing anyone who cared about her health, they ensured no dissenting voices, no medical interventions, and no pleas for sanity ever reached her ears. They isolated her completely from reality. The profound betrayal of her inner circle extended far beyond mere complicity. It was a proactive, calculated architectural design of her ruin. Her personal management and agency representatives, the very individuals legally bound by fiduciary duty to protect her health and longevity, were the ones actively negotiating these impossible terms directly with the casino executives. They sat in air-conditioned boardrooms and traded her cartilage and vocal health for higher percentages of the gate and lucrative back-end casino deals. They willingly signed the brutal 14-show-a-week contracts, fully aware of her degrading physical condition, simply to secure their own exorbitant, guaranteed management commissions. They fed her directly into the machinery. The most profound, lasting, and irreversible damage, however, occurred deep underground, inside the psychological solitary confinement of her dressing room. These backstage spaces were not the glamorous, airy, flower-filled suites the public imagined. They were often windowless, heavily reinforced concrete bunkers situated directly beneath the chaotic, ringing casino floor. They reeked constantly of harsh medical alcohol, heavy aerosol hairspray, burning stage lights, and stale, anxious sweat. They offered absolutely no comfort, no fresh air, and no natural sunlight. The violent daily sensory whiplash she experienced was psychologically shattering. To go from the deafening physical roar of a 2,000-person standing ovation, bathed in blinding, searing light and unconditional public adoration, to the dead, suffocating concrete silence of that underground room actively fractured her grip on reality. This extreme environmental shift, combined with the heavy brain-altering narcotics, triggered severe daily episodes of clinical depersonalization. It was a severe trauma response where she felt entirely disconnected from her own physical body, her surroundings, and her own mind. She was becoming a ghost in her own life, a spectator to her own highly publicized execution. Yet no amount of liquid cortisone could numb the mind, and as the heavy barbiturates eventually wore off, she was left completely stranded in the suffocating, windowless isolation of her dressing room. It was in these brutal, chemically depleted hours, entirely cut off from the reality of the outside world by her protective yet parasitic entourage, that the true psychological toll of her isolation manifested. In the darkest, most profoundly isolated hours of the early morning, usually between 4 and 5 o'clock, when even the frantic energy of the Las Vegas Strip briefly dips into an eerie, exhausted lull, the severe chemical crash would inevitably take hold of Liza Minnelli's biology. As the artificial synthetic adrenaline and the illicit dopamine plummeted violently from her bloodstream, the fragile boundaries of her own identity began to dissolve into a terrifying, inescapable void. The human brain is not designed to process the extreme neurological whiplash of a cocaine high immediately followed by a barbiturate suppression. The sudden absolute depletion of neurotransmitters leaves the mind completely defenseless against its own darkest intrusive thoughts. The dopamine receptors, having been forcefully flooded and held wide open for hours by the stimulants, were now entirely tapped out, plunging her into a state of acute, chemically induced anhedonia, the absolute inability to feel pleasure or hope. This complete sensory deprivation quickly morphed into a terrifying echo chamber for her deepest unspoken traumas, amplifying every insecurity in the dead silence of the Nevada night. Sitting entirely alone before the harsh, unforgiving, bright, incandescent bulbs of the dressing room vanity mirror, the residual stage adrenaline rapidly replacing itself with a creeping cold dread, she would slowly begin the grueling process of wiping away the heavy theatrical armor. She applied cold cream to dissolve the thick, sweat-proof grease paint. She meticulously peeled off the false eyelashes that felt as heavy as lead and stared at the sharp, exhausted angles of her own hollowed cheekbones under the glaring, shadowless light. In those terrifying, silent moments of severe chemical withdrawal, stripped of the glittering Halston sequins, the iconic Foss bowler hats, and the manufactured kinetic energy, she did not see herself looking back. She saw the gaunt, tragic, universally recognized face of her mother, Judy Garland, staring straight back at her from the glass. This was not a mere passing physical resemblance. It was a haunting physiological confirmation of her absolute darkest fears. Clutching a glass of warm vodka and a plastic prescription bottle of sedatives, a brutal moment of absolute horrifying clarity would occasionally wash over her in the silence of the room. She recognized the terrifying, perfect symmetry of her existence. She saw the inescapable, multi-generational trap she was caught in. She was fully agonizingly aware that she was being marched directly into the exact same corporate slaughterhouse that had systematically consumed and destroyed her mother just a decade prior. The parallels were not just poetic, they were a precise forensic duplication of abuse. When Judy Garland was a child star in the 1930s and 1940s, the all-powerful MGM studio executives, led by men like Louis B. Mayer, had operated exactly like the casino bosses. MGM doctors had fed a young Judy pep pills to keep her filming for 18 hours a day, and then handed her sleeping pills to knock her out at night. They had tightly controlled her weight, dictated her schedule, and viewed her simply as a highly profitable piece of studio property. Now, decades later, the Las Vegas machine was executing the exact same genetic death sentence in real time, live on stage for a paying audience. Liza was swallowing the exact same classes of highly addictive pharmaceutical sedatives. She was performing in the exact same unforgiving high-pressure environments. She was being drained dry by the next generation of the exact same invisible, ruthless corporate executives who had driven her mother into an early tragic grave in 1969. The Las Vegas hospitality machine did not differentiate between the mother and the daughter. It only saw a highly exploitable bloodline that was ruthlessly efficient at generating massive casino drops. Yet, the true defining tragedy of Liza Minnelli lies in her psychological response to this horrifying realization. Her reaction was not to flee the trap. Her reaction was driven by a deep-seated, paralyzing terror of the alternative. If she canceled the shows, breached her multi-million-dollar corporate contracts, and walked away into the quiet desert night to heal her broken body and mind, the media vultures were primed and waiting to tear her apart. The 1970s and 1980s tabloid press, publications like the National Enquirer, and the aggressive paparazzi agencies of the era operated with a vicious, unyielding cruelty, particularly toward the children of tragic icons. They did not care about the biomechanics of a ruined knee or the realities of corporate medical malpractice. They were eager and ready to crucify her on the front pages, to slap her with the devastating permanent label of a failure. If she stopped performing, they would not portray her as a survivor who bravely escaped a predatory billion-dollar hospitality industry. They would portray her as a broken, defective replica. They would write the exact headline she feared most, that she was a weak, tragic woman doomed to inevitably repeat her mother's fatal, embarrassing mistakes. A canceled tour, a trip to a hospital, or a plea for rest would be spun not as self-preservation, but as an inevitable, sensationalized mental breakdown. The narrative of the tragic Garland women was too profitable for the tabloids to pass up. The stage, incredibly and perversely, became her only perceived shield against that crushing public narrative. As long as she was dancing, she was winning. As long as she was singing, she was in control. As long as she was generating millions of dollars and receiving standing ovations, she was not her mother lying dead in a locked London bathroom. In the ruthless, unsentimental ecosystem of Las Vegas, the bright neon marquee acts as a swift and merciless guillotine. The exact moment an artist stops generating massive gambling revenue, their name is stripped from the towering signs and replaced by the next desperate act without a second thought, without a pension, and without a word of gratitude. Oblivion in this town happens with the speed of a snapping finger, erasing decades of agonizing, backbreaking labor in an instant. Programmed from early childhood by the relentless, transactional entertainment industry, having grown up physically on the very MGM studio lots where human beings were treated as rapidly depreciating corporate assets, she harbored a deep-seated, unshakable, and deeply tragic belief regarding her own self-worth. She fundamentally believed that her existence only held value when it was being actively, loudly validated by the applause of paying strangers. The deafening roar of the audience in the dark became her only source of artificial psychological oxygen. Without the blinding heat of the spotlight, she genuinely believed she would simply cease to exist, trapped entirely between the agonizing, inescapable ghost of her mother's past and the vicious, waiting vultures of the tabloid press. She found herself with no safe avenue of escape. This relentless, suffocating pressure forged a tragic, twisted logic in her mind. If she was destined to be consumed by the exact same entertainment machine that had killed Judy Garland, she would dictate the terms of her own destruction. This realization marked the darkest turning point of her Las Vegas tenure, where corporate exploitation morphed into a devastating campaign of conscious, deliberate self-sacrifice. To survive the immense, crushing cognitive dissonance of her daily life, knowing the Las Vegas machine was systematically killing her, yet feeling utterly, psychologically dependent upon its validation. Liza Minnelli actively split her personality into two distinct, irreconcilable entities. There was the shattered, bleeding, chemically dependent, and terrified reality hidden away in the underground concrete dressing room. And then there was the glittering, invincible armor of the global superstar on stage, projecting an absolute bulletproof illusion of boundless joy and manic kinetic energy. That impossibly wide, frozen smile she flashed to the cheering crowd, often cited by theater critics as her signature. Irrepressible charm was not a genuine expression of happiness. It was a mechanical, desperate, heavily rehearsed barricade. It was meticulously constructed to hide a deep, paralyzing panic from the world. The absolute harrowing peak of this tragedy is that the abuse eventually transitioned from a strict corporate mandate to an act of conscious, willing self-immolation. As the years wore on and the physiological trauma compounded, the iron ring of enablers no longer had to forcefully pour the drinks or push the pills across the vanity table. The chemical loop had become her baseline. She was pouring the vodka and taking the heavy doses herself. Stricken with a profound, crippling survivor's guilt regarding her mother's tragic death, she began to actively punish her own body. Psychologically, it was a subconscious, desperate, and deeply tragic way to physically share the intense agony Judy Garland had endured before her untimely passing. Minnelli made a rational, devastating calculation in the lonely, drug-fueled hours of the dark. She chose to literally set fire to her own meniscal cartilage, burn out her own peripheral nerve endings with alcohol, and tear her own vocal cords to bleeding shreds. She did this just to keep the massive casino showrooms illuminated and the crowds cheering for one more night. She decided it was better to violently explode into ash under the blinding heat of the spotlight than to retreat into the shadows, heal her broken biology, and risk being entirely forgotten by the world that had promised to love her conditionally. The bill for this biological extortion finally came due in 1984. When Liza Minnelli entered the Betty Ford Clinic, it was not merely a celebrity wellness retreat. It was a desperate, emergency medical intervention to prevent total cardiovascular and organ failure. Stripped of the daily, heavily regulated influx of pharmaceutical cocaine, barbiturates, and neat vodka, her central nervous system was thrust into a state of absolute, agonizing rebellion. For years, her brain had been artificially bathed in synthetic dopamine and adrenaline to survive the Fosse choreography, followed by heavy depressants to simulate sleep. Without these chemicals, she plunged into a severe, paralyzing clinical depression. The physical withdrawal was a physiological nightmare. Without the heavy daily doses of liquid cortisone and numbing alcohol to paralyze her pain receptors, the true, unmasked reality of her skeletal destruction finally crashed down upon her conscious mind. The absolute blinding agony of her pulverized knee cartilage and her compressed lumbar spine, pain that had been chemically silenced by years of heavy substance abuse, hit her central nervous system all at once. She was forced to completely rebuild her psychological existence and confront her raw, unmedicated reality without the numbing shield of narcotics flowing through her bloodstream. It was a terrifying preview of the physical collapse she would face decades later in the year 2000, when a severe viral infection would literally force her to relearn how to walk and speak all over again. Even after her harrowing stint at the clinic, the Las Vegas machine was not finished with her. When she inevitably returned to the Strip in the subsequent years to honor remaining contractual obligations, the dynamics had shifted into a new, cruel psychological test. The casino executives now marketed her sobriety as the new spectacle. The crowds bought tickets to scrutinize her, waiting to see if the fragile, unmedicated star would crack under the immense pressure of the showroom. She was forced to face the blinding follow spots, the deafening orchestras, and the ruthless expectations of the drop with a completely raw, unshielded central nervous system. Every note she sang and every step she took sober was haunted by the phantom muscle memory of the chemicals that used to carry her through the routine, making the mere act of standing on the stage a profound, daily psychological battle. Look at the absolute end of the timeline, long after the thunderous applause has finally faded into history and the Las Vegas neon signs of her era have been unceremoniously dismantled and sent to the boneyard. You will find a woman confined to a wheelchair, her body painstakingly stitched back together by modern medical science. She carries the permanent, irreversible physical wreckage of a career that demanded absolute, unmitigated biological sacrifice. The damage to her hip sockets from the violent, repetitive pelvic thrusts of her stage routines was so absolute that the bone tissue had essentially died from a lack of blood supply. She required multiple highly invasive total hip replacement surgeries. Orthopedic surgeons had to physically saw away the necrotic bone of her femurs and hammer heavy titanium spikes and synthetic ball joints directly into her skeleton just to give her a baseline quality of life. She endured complete double knee reconstructions to replace the cartilage she left on the wooden stages of the Sahara and Bally's. She underwent severe stabilizing spinal fusions to repair the collapsed discs in her back. Her vocal cords, permanently scarred by the bone-dry desert air, the secondary smoke, and the aggressive belting, required intensive medical rehabilitation just to allow her to speak without severe strain. To fully comprehend the sheer, unfeeling brutality of the Las Vegas entertainment machine, one must examine what happens when the biological engine finally seizes. What occurs when the chemical pit stops fail, when the titanium joints can no longer support the weight of the sequins, and when the artist physically collapses, rendering them unable to generate the nightly casino drop. The hospitality industry does not offer a graceful exit, a corporate pension plan, or a period of dignified recovery. It executes a highly efficient, legally bulletproof corporate disposal protocol. The exact moment Liza Minnelli's body became a financial liability rather than a high-yield asset, the iron ring of enablers, lawyers, and casino executives initiated a ruthless process of total erasure. The transition is terrifying in its speed and its complete lack of sentimentality. The space that had served as her psychological solitary confinement, the room that had absorbed her panic attacks, her grief, and her chemical withdrawals, was treated like a contaminated industrial site. Casino maintenance crews were immediately dispatched. They cleared the room with the ruthless efficiency of a standard hotel turnover. The lingering heavy odors of aerosol hairspray and medical antiseptic were aggressively neutralized with industrial bleach. Out in the blinding desert sun, the ultimate symbol of Las Vegas power, the towering multi-million-dollar neon marquee, was altered in a matter of hours. The massive glass letters spelling out her name were unceremoniously pulled down by men in utility trucks, tossed into storage crates, and immediately replaced by the next act. Decades of agonizing, backbreaking labor and cellular sacrifice were erased from the Las Vegas skyline, with the simple flick of an electrical switch. The moment she stopped producing revenue, the massive, sycophantic entourage that had isolated her instantly vanished. The free penthouse suites, the comped meals, and the manufactured deference evaporated overnight. She was left entirely alone to pay the profound compounding physical and emotional bill for a party that the casino had hosted. We casually remember Liza Minnelli as a blazing, untouchable symbol of boundless theatrical energy. But beneath the iconic eyelashes lies a deeply unsettling forensic reality. She was a flawless, undefeated capitalist, machine's greatest victim. The casinos plugged her into the massive neon grid of the showroom, artificially supercharged her with chemicals and applause, and systematically drained her of her energy to keep the roulette wheels spinning. Her legacy serves as a chilling, permanent reminder of how an industry effortlessly turns human suffering, generational trauma, and profound grief into highly effective casino bait.